So, to sum it up, I had this commander deck given to me for anyone who is actually viewing at the moment. And as usual, I made some cuts. And because he had a very tight budget, I gave him some cheap ads. And if he likes the deck, also some more juicy, more fun, more expensive cards to add. So yeah, depending on how much money he actually wants to spend, since he said his budget is not set in stone, we will leave it at that. I unfortunately didn't have that many expensive cards to cut, so what I could add was really not much from the default deck. But yeah, we'll see. So basically, Tegrid, for those who don't know her, is give me a second. I'm just getting pinged. Okay. So Tegrid, for those who don't know her, is a commander. It's a legendary creature. It's a god from the metal plane. What was it again? Culthaven. And basically what's interesting about her, or what is the relevant text on her, is she costs 5 mana, 3 and a black, so we can only play black cards as her backside is also black. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from the graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So any permanent card is fair game, artifacts, lands, enchantments, creatures, although black obviously has a lot more, has a lot easier time to get your opponent to sacrifice creatures. The card also has a backside.
Hey, what's up? Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, here, I can hear you. I was just explaining the card. Can you hear me?
If you can hear me.
Oh, sorry, you can't hear me. Give me a second. I need to adjust my Discord.
Well, I can hear you now.
Yes, you can hear me now, right. I had it set to push to talk. So, yeah, let me just quickly make some notes about your card, Tegrid. So basically, the relevant text here is for our deck tuning. She costs 5 mana. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from the graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. And she also has a backside, which is the Lantern. The Lantern is tap, target player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. And for 4 mana, you can untap Tegrid's Lantern, which is relevant if you have a high budget build or if you are really lucky with your draws, but usually you will not play it for the Lantern side unless you will add the Phyrexian Altar here, because this can easily net you infinite colored mana.
Okay.
So let's go over the categories where I sorted your cards first, then we'll go over the cuts, and I'll tell you my thoughts to the cards. So lands, your land selection basically looked fine. I removed 1 land because it's a trap. We will look at the land soon. Other than that, your land selection looks quite fine. There are 3 lands that I would suggest adding and maybe cutting swamps, and these would be Cabal Coffers, Yavgmoth, Urborg Tomb of Yavgmoth. You know the combo. Urborg says everything is a swamp, and Cabal Coffers says add mana for each swamp you control, but these are obviously a bit more expensive than your budget, so I left them out here. At the moment, they are quite cheap-ish, because both of them recently got reprinted, so you can pick them up probably cheaper than any time in the future, and you will play them in any deck that plays black, and you have tutors to get them out, so they might be nice, but as they exceed your budget, I didn't add them here just to bring them to your attention. The other land that I would recommend that's also a bit more expensive, I'm not actually sure about the English price, since it was just reprinted. Yeah, it's also 30 bucks. Would be Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which is another land that's great to play in monocolored decks. So basically it can either tap for a regular mana, for a neutral mana, or for 2 mana and tap you can choose a color and then you add mana equal to your devotion. If you do not want to add any of those expensive lands, simply add a swamp. That's totally fine. So for the land that I cut, it is, give me a second, Crypt of Agadim. So Crypt of Agadim enters the battlefield tapped, which already sucks, and it's tap, add black to your mana pool, and for 2 and tap you add black to your mana pool for each black creature card in your graveyard. Now your total deck when you gave it to me had 12 creatures, so in order for this to actually work, you would have to have a quarter of your creatures and your deck in your graveyard. And since you're not actually self-milling, this card will 99% of the time not do anything at all. I know the card
Okay.
looks great, and it also trapped me when I got into Magic. I have this card, I think, 4 copies of it. I think I activated it once successfully in a Marin deck. It's really a trap card. Okay, so that's for the lands. For the protection, I like your protection set with Kaya's Ghost Form, Lightning Greaves, and Swiftfoot Boots. There is another protection card that you could consider adding, that would be Imp's Mischief, which would allow you to redirect a spell to someone else, but that's too expensive, so I left it out entirely, since I hope this protection will be enough. Other than that, I added some reanimation, so if your opponents remove your Tegrid, you could let her go to the graveyard and reanimate her. Now your tutors, again, these were the tutors that were already inside the deck, which is fine. Except for Wishclaw Talisman, maybe, you would have to see how often this will bite yourself in the ass.
Okay.
Now for removal, your removal was mostly fine. I especially like Desolation, since it forces each player to tap the land in a turn, to sacrifice 1 land at the end of the turn. And if you have Tegrid out, you will get the lands back that your opponent sacrificed, since they are permanents. And so everything that forces your opponents to sacrifice lands is great. We have Innocent Blood. Each player sacrifices a creature is fine. Each opponent sacrifices a creature is also fine. Opponent sacrifices an enchantment, the rare black enchantment hate. If you find yourself facing a lot of hate enchantments that will just hate your deck out, like Rest in Peace. Let me just pull it up. Rest in Peace. Yeah, MTG. So Rest in Peace. Whenever, if a card would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. This would obviously be a hard counter to Tegrid. If you continue encountering this, you could either use 1 with nothing, I think. 1 with nothing? No, wait, 1 with nothing is discarding your entire hand. 7, destroy target permanent. You could either use Spine of Ishsat, which can destroy permanents, or Unstable Obelisk, or there's another one from the Eldrazi, Scroll from Existence. These are all really expensive, but you don't have that much hate against enchantments and also artifacts. So these 3 cards would be backup options in case you are facing a lot of hate. I didn't add them now because I guess you don't at the moment. Now, where were we? Right, we have the enchantment. Again, everyone sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, which is fine. Each opponent sacrifices the most expensive thing. Split second, and 1 player sacrifices a creature that may be not good enough, so you might want to remove this one if it's not good enough. Eldest Reborn is a bit expensive, but fine, and Vona's Hunger is actually very good. Now for your discard, you started with 22 discard spells, and this is actually the most of what I cut. Because discard is a valid strategy to slow your opponents down, but once your opponents are out of hand, you actually can't let them discard anything else. So most discard spells are sorcery speed, and there's a good reason why they are, because your opponents shouldn't be locked by your discard spells, is the design philosophy of the usual discard spell. So if you have a ton of discard spells and your opponents don't have any cards in their hand, your discard spells are useless. Which is why I especially liked your addition of Temple Bell. And this will allow each player to draw a card, and then you can let them discard and get the discarded cards back with Tegrid. So this one is quite fine. But as I said, I cut a lot of discard and I added more removal instead. Because your opponents will be able to play something unless you play stacks, and I don't think you want to play stacks. Do you want to play stacks?
What's stacks?
Stacks is the everyone hates you, and this is banned on every EDH table archetype. Stacks plays a lot of stuff that forces each player to sacrifice permanents, and also this is the sacrifice in the stacks. And the tax is basically stuff that makes your stuff more expensive. So basically you would play things like Smokestack. This would... MTG. So this would
be... Yeah, I'm familiar with Smokestack. I checked it out. I almost put it in. I just kind of excluded it once I went more of a discard direction, because I thought it was too expensive just to like splash in.
I actually have Smokestack on the list that I would suggest you adding, but I will explain you why later. So Smokestack would be the sacrifice part of a stack, and Trinisphere could be a part of the tech stack. So Trinisphere basically says if a spell would cost less than 3, it costs 3 instead. And you have a lot of such things, but it's mostly not in mono black what you would play in stacks, but usually you also play blue and white because they add some great synergy cards. But yeah, there are a lot of stacks cards, and people don't like to play against them, even less than they like to play against this card. I did a stack once, I think, and my playgroup instantly banned it after I played it. Because it's just not fun to play against decks unless you have decks that can actually do so. Now,
yeah, probably don't want to get it banned.
yeah,
yeah, I think that's
you don't want to get a deck banned once you build it. So, right, we have Wonasanger. One thing I almost cut was Smallpox until I realized it has synergy because it destroys your opponent's lands. You will probably not want to play Smallpox until your commander is out to actually get value from it. Now you have some mana cards, which are fine because they will fasten your game plan. You may want to think about taking Solemn Simulacrum out. I don't think it's fast enough or doing enough for you. So keep this in mind that this one is a potential gunner. The rest of them is fine. Just keep in mind why you are allowed to play Cryptghast, because the color white is actually in the rules reminder text, which is why it's allowed in a mono black deck. Just in case anyone complains, this is legal for Commander. Okay, now your discard synergy is fine. Asylum Visitor lets you draw cards. Grass Gimera lets you draw cards. Tiny Bones lets you draw cards. And Waste Not can actually win you the game if it generates enough mana for you. Finisher. These are basically, well, we could also put Smallpox there. These are basically what you want to play once your commander is out. And these will most likely win you the game. So Dark Deal will fill up your opponent's hands and will allow you to, first of all, get everything they discarded, and then if you have more discard spells, you can let them discard even more. You have the Death Cloud, which will force your opponents to sacrifice lands. And so if you manage to get a lot of mana in there, you just get all of their lands and don't worry about it. And don't worry if you need to sacrifice Tegrid. So even if something sacrifices all creatures, Tegrid's ability will still trigger in that instance. So in this case, you will actually not get the lands in this case because it's then sacrifices all lands. So Tegrid will be on the graveyard for Death Cloud, but you will still get the creatures at least. So you will get everything they discard and you will get the creatures, but you will not get the lands in this case because lands are sacrificed last. They are sacrificed in the order and that it's written on the card. So Delirium Skeins, again, just discarding 3 cards is probably enough for you to win the game. Fraying Omnipotence, again, they discard their hand, then the creatures, you will get a lot of stuff. Smallpox, it's not that game winning, but again, with 3 opponents, you rob each of them of a land, you get yourself 3 lands, you get yourself 3 creatures. Hopefully you don't need to sack Tegrid to it, but that's why it's here for only 2 mana. And Torment of Hailfire, you can just use this if you manage to generate a lot of mana. Now for draw, your draw spells are okay. You might want to take out Read the Bones later because it might not be fast enough with 3 mana. But again, this is something that you can adjust if you find yourself having too many cards, since you already built some nice card draw into your lands. Now, that's for the cards that are left here and how to play them. So usually how you want to start your game is you either... ideally you would have Sol Ring here. You will basically want to ramp on turn 2, play anything synergistic on turn 3, maybe even discard, and then play Tegrid on turn 4, and then have your opponents discard or play a finisher on turn 5. You can fasten your game plan by playing Dark Ritual or Camel Ritual, obviously. In this case, you can play Tegrid a turn or 2 early. Just keep in mind that your opponents may be holding removal for her, especially once they got used to her. So ideally, if you have the hand, which you will not always have since you don't have all the expensive cards like Mana Crypt and Mana Vault, Ideally, you would play Tegrid and then you would immediately play Smallpox or Delirium Skeins or something cheap to get instant value out of her. Now, as I said, what I cut are mostly the discard cards, so some single discard cards and some expensive discard cards that would do nothing but discarding. So we will skip over all of the discard cards due to time reasons. I think you said you only had an hour of time. So what else did I cut? I cut Nyx Lotus because when will you need a lot of mana? You will need a lot of mana if you lost your commander and you will need to recast your commander. If you need to recast your commander, you probably just suffer the board wipe and won't have much black on your battlefield, so your devotion to black will be quite low. So in this case, Nyx Lotus is really not doing you any help. Rather go for more reliable ways to generate mana. I cut Migrim and Liliana's Keras because while you will have your opponents discarding cards, these two cards are really more suited to a wheel deck. Do you know wheel decks?
Yeah, I know. It's like
Okay.
you keep like picking up cards and then discarding.
Yes, right. So unless you're running a wheel deck, which you're not at the moment, since wheels are mostly blue and red, these cards will not deal enough damage and will be mostly an annoyance rather than really helping you or hurting your opponents, unless your opponents are on a serious low life strategy. So if they repeatedly sacrifice their own life points, these might do something, but other than that, your opponents won't be discarding that many cards unless they draw a lot of cards, because you only start with 7 cards and you are playing an average of 1 to 2 cards each turn. So if you are playing your commander, your opponents will probably be on 3 cards, maybe even 2 or 1 cards at a time. And if you then start to let them discard cards, it's not going to do much. So that's why I cut them. I also cut any single discard cards with more than 2. With CMC more than 2. Cunning Lysimancer, I think this one is fine-ish. I just cut it because it was expensive and I wanted to make room for other cards that I thought fit better. Call of Annihilation, it gives your opponents the choice. It makes you the Monarch, which makes you a target, and I don't think you want this. And Bad Deal is just, as the card is aptly named, a bad deal. Drawing 2 cards and having your opponents discarding 2 cards for 6 mana is really not worth it. So this is what I took out. Now for putting stuff into your deck, I made 2 different piles. The first is the cheap pile and the second is the expensive pile. Okay. So I'll run you through each of the cards now and then we can see what we want to add. Because yeah, as you can see, the cheap pile is basically your budget. I took about $50 out and I'm taking about $50 in. While the expensive pile has a lot of really interesting stuff, which is really expensive, but also fun to play and good. So let's first look at the cheap pile. Now, let me see, what do I want to go to first? So first of all, we have some cheap creatures here. We have the Merciless Executioner, which is basically the same thing like, where do we have him? Like Demon's Disciple. When he enters the battlefield, each opponent needs to sacrifice a creature and you yourself too. So it doesn't target Planeswalker, which is why your cards are better. But if you find yourself wanting this effect more, you can add the Merciless Executioner. And there's also a second card that has the same effect, which I did not add here. We also have the Rain of Filth, which allows you each land you control gain sacrifice this land, add black to your mana pool until end of turn. So this one will allow you to have a single really explosive turn. And during this turn, you will hopefully get your opponents to sacrifice a lot of lands or just die because you won't have any lands after that turn.
Yeah, that's true.
But this will allow you for a single explosive turn. Now,
Okay.
we have the Profane Tutor, which is quite nice because it got Suspend 2. And you can play it for 2. So usually for 2, you will want to play your Mana Rock. So you can play your commander on turn 4. So if you play your Mana Rock on turn 2, you can play or you can suspend Profane Tutor on turn 3, which will allow you to play your commander on turn 4 and then tutor something up on turn 5. So if you untap with your commander, you get exactly the card that you need to get the most effect out of your commander. So if your opponents have a lot of cards in hand, you might want to go for a discard. If your opponents have big creatures, you might want to go for creatures and so on. So this one really ties in nicely into your when your commander drops and when you can actually use your commander usually.
Okay.
And it's also just another cheap tutor, so yeah, it's just cheap at the moment. Now, we also have Argyll's Blood Feast here, which is basically a cheap, expensive, it's basically Greed. So Greed for 1 black, pay 2 life, draw a card. Argyll's Blood Feast is you can play it for 2, so you can play it out more early. Again, pay 2 life, you can draw a card. And in theory, you can flip it if you have 5 or less life at the beginning of your upkeep, but in my experience, this doesn't happen too often in Commanders, so don't get your hopes up. But if you flip it, you can make it a land that just adds black mana to your mana pool, and you can sacrifice a creature while tapping this land, and then you gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness, which again is not too much in your deck, but it might help you just to survive long enough. So again, this is just another draw spell that you have in your deck for more. Sorry. Then you have another draw spell that you have for more consistency. That's the word I'm searching for. So now we have Animate Dead. Animate Dead is just a cheap way to. It is cheap, right? Wait, what did I do? Where's Animate Dead gone? Okay, let me just pull up the card. Animate Dead. I somehow removed it. So Animate Dead is just a cheap way to reanimate your commander. So if your commander dies, it touches the graveyard, and once your commander touches another zone, you have the ability to place it into your command zone instead. And in this case, if they remove your commander by making you kill your commander, you can simply reanimate her to get her back, which is quite nice, obviously, because paying 2 is way cheaper than paying 7 for the second time you cast her. Now, the other stuff that I added here is actually a combo, and most of the combo revolves around Treacherous Pit Dweller. So let's have a look at Treacherous Pit Dweller. It's a 4/3 for 2 black mana. It's also cheap monetary-wise, which is why it's quite nice to include it here. And it has Undying, so if it dies and if it had no +1/+1 counter on it, you return it to the battlefield under your control. And then, if it enters the battlefield from a graveyard, an opponent gains control of it.
Okay.
Now, why is this great? Simple. You have 2 cards, or 3 if you go for the expensive card, that will allow you to make an infinite combo with this.
Okay.
The cards are basically the Grave Pact cards. So you have Grave Pact. Whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. You have Dictate of Erebos, same thing. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. And you have the Butcher of Malakir. Again, whenever a creature dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. And I've also built in some sack outlets for you here for 2 reasons. First of all, for the combo. But second, sack outlets can also protect your commander, and sack outlets in general are just very, very strong. So how do you protect your commander? Simple. You told me before that you had an issue with people stealing your commander. Basically, if someone targets your commander with a steal effect, you sacrifice her. Sure, she is more expensive than, but at least your opponent does not have your commander. Now, the sack outlets I added at the moment because, again, the cheap sack outlets are at Altar of Dementia. Sacrifice a creature, target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power from the top of his or her library into their graveyard. Basically, if you can do this an infinite amount of times, you just mill your opponents out and win. We have Ashnod's Altar, which is nice because you can also sacrifice creatures just to generate mana for some big stupid spell. And you can also sacrifice your opponent's creatures in case they have something like Homeward Pass to get their creatures back.
Can I sacrifice any creature?
What? Yeah, you can
Ashnod's
just any creature that you control.
Okay. Cool.
So you need to control the creature, but then you can just sacrifice any creature at any time. This is why sack outlets that do not have any costs outside of sacrificing a creature are so strong. You can sacrifice any creature that you control at the moment at instant speed. Okay. So if anyone targets your creature, you simply sacrifice it and it's gone. This is also great if someone wants to exile stuff that you would rather have in your graveyard. if someone tries to get his creature back, and so on and so forth, you can simply always sacrifice the creature and then it's in the graveyard instead of wherever else it would go. Playing sack outlets is something that is really, really strong that you usually would not think about, but sack outlets enable so many good plays if you, if you just have cards out of crickets. We also have another sack outlet. Let me check where it is.
The only thing with my group that we kind of like stray away from is infinite combos.
Okay, so
like we might run them once in a while. Like if we run a deck, it's like, hey, we're running a deck with an infinite combo. Everybody's gonna pull out like their strongest decks, and like it's kind of like we might do it like once. But like if this is a deck that I would like to use more than once, because I don't have many decks, so I like to play my decks often. Infinite combos would probably be like a big no.
This infinite combo is not an infinite combo that you will see every game. So this is just one.
Okay.
I will teach you how it's done later, and you can tell. So I guess your group will find the rule interaction quite nifty, and it's also nothing that will turn up every game. Okay. So this deck is not here to play on the infinite combo, but it has an infinite combo included in it because the sack outlets are just strong, and then you just need to add Treacherous Pit Dweller.
Okay.
But you can take him out. As you can see, it's just 35 cents, and then the deck will still work.
Okay.
Now we have the Sadistic Hypnotist. He is an interesting sack outlet, also quite cheap monetary-wise, unfortunately not mana-wise. Sacrifice a creature, target player discards 2 cards from his or her hand. So again, if you want to get rid of a creature and an opponent has some nifty cards in their hand that you want to get with Tegrid, you can simply sacrifice whatever other creatures you have, and they have to discard your hands. Also, if you have Tegrid out and him out, you sacrifice a creature. If an opponent discards a creature card, you can sacrifice that creature to get rid of your other opponent's hands, and so on. So this is a nice way to get your opponents to discard their hands. And Wizards here, yeah, it's a cheap sack outlet. You can scry 1, which is strong, but it's not really doing that much for the deck. So now, how does Treacherous Pit Dweller work? So basically, you sacrifice him with, as I said, you need the Pit Dweller, the Dictate of Erebos, you need your commander, and you need any sack outlet. Now, you sack the Pit Dweller. Whatever the sack outlet does happens, so let's say you get 2 mana, and then Undying triggers, so Pit Dweller will return to the battlefield. Now, next thing, so you still have the Dictate of Erebos trigger on this deck, and above that, the Treacherous Pit Dweller gets taken by an opponent's step. So now, your opponent will gain control of Treacherous Pit Dweller, and now your opponent will need to sacrifice a creature. Now, first, he can sacrifice one of his creatures. In this case, you get a creature, and you sacrifice the creature, and again, your opponent needs to sacrifice a creature, and you get a creature, and so on, until at one point he will need to sacrifice Treacherous Pit Dweller. So Treacherous Pit Dweller dies on your opponent, and due to the effect of your commander, you get Treacherous Pit Dweller back, but not to the Undying effect, but you just get it back regularly without a +1/+1 counter. Now, as
I'm kind of lost. Why do they have to sacrifice? So what is it with Dictate of Erebos that makes them sacrifice it?
Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature.
Oh, okay. So now they have a choice. So they can. Okay, I see what you mean. So they can either kill their own creature or kill the. Okay, I see what you mean. Okay.
So
and more likely than not, they don't want to kill their own combo pieces. So they're more likely they're not going to kill this.
Still, even if they kill their own creatures, you get their creature. You sacrifice their creature, so they have to sacrifice another creature.
Okay.
So once you have Dictate of Erebos online, you will basically clear their board if you manage to get one of your creatures dying.
Okay.
Because one of your creatures die, you get your opponent's creatures, you sacrifice them, your opponents will have to sacrifice more creatures, you get more creatures, and so on. Okay. So that is why Dictate of Erebos, Grave Pact, and the Butcher are really strong here. Now,
okay. So it's almost like a board wipe in a way.
Yes, but a one-sided board wipe because you keep your creatures outside of those that you sacrifice. And now, what is extra nifty with Treacherous Pit Dweller is, so as I said, your opponent had him, and now you get him back without Undying, and obviously he ended from a graveyard, so the trigger that an opponent would take control of him is on the stack. Now you sacrifice him while he is still under your control. He goes to your graveyard, Undying triggers, and now two things trigger. Dictate of Erebos trigger, you put that trigger on the bottom, And now Undying triggers, you put that trigger on the top. Your Treacherous Pit Dweller gets back into the game, or onto the battlefield, and now it triggers since it entered from a graveyard, and an opponent gains control of it. And now the Dictate of Erebos triggers, and now the opponent has to sacrifice it. Since the opponent sacrificed it, you get it. You sacrifice it, it comes back, an opponent gets it, he needs to sacrifice it, you get it back. You sacrifice it, it comes back, and so on. So this is how you can make infinite use of your sack outlets. Did you get that?
Yeah.
Okay, otherwise I can also write it down for you if you want to, because it's a quite a convoluted combo that needs to use this deck. But as I said, it's just, I would just run this card because it's 35 cents. So there's no harm done in ordering it. You can take it out of this combo noise you're playing group, but I would play it at least once.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
You can take it out later. So these are the cards that I would add if you're just looking for something cheap to add. Now we come to the juicy cards that are a lot more fun, but also a lot more expensive. So if you like the deck, you can think about adding these. Oh, sorry, this card shouldn't be here, but up here. There's one last card that I wanted to add. This is Killing Wave. It's also relatively cheap. It's a sorcery. You pay black and X, and for each creature its controller sacrifices it unless he or she pays X life. So basically you play Tegrid for 5, you play this for 5, and then for each creature, each opponent needs to pay 5 life, or they sacrifice the creature and you get a creature.
Okay.
So if they have a lot of creatures, this will only work if your opponent play a lot of creature. This won't work against Voltron strategies because they will just pay 5 life. But if your opponents play broad strategies, you can use this card. If not, just cut this card.
Okay.
Now, for the expensive cards. First of all is I have no idea how to actually pronounce this card. Ad nauseam. So your deck is quite cheap mana-wise, CMC-wise. So as you can see, your CMC stops at 5. And most of your cards actually cost 2.
Okay.
More than half of your deck is mana cost 1, 2, or 0, since you have lands in here too. So Ad nauseam, do you know the card?
I owned one in the past. I traded it away. I don't really know what it does though.
Okay, so basically for 5 mana it's an instant, so you can play it at before it's your turn. Okay. Reveal the top card of your library and you put that card into your hand. Note that it's not draw, so it gets around stuff like Narset that prevents you from drawing cards.
Okay.
And you lose life equal to the converted mana cost of the card. And you can do this any amount of times. So if you're lucky, you can draw 20, 30 cards just with this card. So this is really a card to get you back into the game if something failed.
Okay.
So this one is, as I said, a bit more expensive. Next off, we have Aweless Dust. This is just a board wipe. Each player sacrifices all colored permanents they control. This includes colored artifacts and also colored enchantments. And in case you would play, which I wouldn't recommend playing, Painter's Servant, this one, which makes all cards that are in play another color. This would also force your opponents to sacrifice all their lands. And then if you have your commander online, you would get everything that your opponent sacrificed. So you get their colored artifacts, you get their enchantments, and you get their creatures back. So this is a great board wipe, which I would probably put in first from the more expensive cards, because it allows you to have some sustainability if your opponents manage to build up a huge board. Now next off, we have something that is only there for speed. So if you realize, okay, I don't want to play the long game, but I would like to go more into a combo on turn 4 direction, which I heard already you wouldn't want to. You would need to add more cheap creatures and then culling the weak, which allows you to sacrifice a creature and then add 4 mana to your mana pool. So basically you could easily play your commander on turn 2 with this. But again, this would only make sense if you're playing for heavy combo, which you already said you wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
So next up we would have Grave Pact. As I said, this is just another whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. This one is usually played less than Dictate of Erebos since it doesn't have flash, and also its 3 black mana costs are quite expensive for most multicolored decks to pay, which is nothing you need to be worried about since you're playing mono black, so you probably have 3 black mana online. So this is another card that I would probably look to add soon. So like Grave Pact, All Dust, and Anasm are cards that I would try to add fast. Jeweled Lotus, super expensive, only if you want to go into really strong combo territory, otherwise just don't bother with it. Now, if you realize you get overwhelmed quite fast by aggro decks, or especially by Swarm or Token decks, you have Coscon Falls, which is a black propaganda. It's just a card that not a lot of people know about. It was a lot cheaper in the past. I'm not sure if I would buy it for $17. Basically, it's a black propaganda. So no creature can attack you unless its controller plays an additional 2 mana whenever that creature attacks. As I said, I probably wouldn't bother with it right now. It's on the reserved list, so that's why it's so expensive. Next off, we have another board wipe, Living Dead. It's not as expensive as it's shown here. Let me just pull up a cheaper version. So you can get it for $9 or $8.50 from the Vault Annihilation. So it's much more reasonable. Each player exiles all creature cards from their graveyards, then sacrifices all creatures they control, and put all cards exiled away onto the battlefield. So basically you exchange the creatures in your graveyard with the creatures on the battlefield. For you, if you have your commander, obviously this means that you exchange the creatures on each player's graveyard with all of their creatures on the battlefield going to you. So you help your opponents out, especially if you had some board wipes, but also you get a lot of creatures from your opponents, and if the graveyards are empty, you can also just use this as a board wipe.
Okay.
So this one is also quite nice, and I would try to add this fast. Next off, we have a card which is super good, but probably too expensive. I'm not sure if it's cheaper with any version. No, it's not. Oh, I bought this for, I think, €5 about a couple of years ago. I think I have 2 of them lying around here. So Memory Jar. For 5 mana. So basically you play this the turn before you play your commander, or maybe even the turn after. Or if you have a lot of mana, you play both. For tap, you can sacrifice Memory Jar. Each player basically exiles their hand, face down, and then draws 7 cards. And at the end of the turn, each player discards their hand and takes back their cards that they exiled. So basically you give all of your opponents 7 cards, and if they don't have a removal and you manage to keep your commander around, they discard their 21 cards at the end of the game. At the end of the round, end of the turn, and you get all of the 21 permanents onto your side of the battlefield. So this one is really, really strong, but probably too expensive, so we'll just skip on this, and you can keep this in mind in case you want to upgrade the deck later on. But really, don't buy this card unless you find yourself really liking the deck. So next up, we have Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Already talked about this one. Next up, we have Painful Quandary. This one is quite nice. It's an enchantment for 5 mana. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. So, since players have 40 life, and probably by the time that they have, that you have 5 mana, they already lost 10 life by whatever. Basically, your opponents have 6 more spells to play this game unless they discard a card. And since you force them to discard cards, each opponent has 6 more spells to play this game. And they better hope that one of the 6 spells is an enchantment removal because they are not playing anything else, unless they want to discard cards into your commander and give you more stuff. So that's also a nice way to lock the game down a bit. Because 5 life, even a commander, is not a cheap life loss. Now next up we have the Phyrexian Altar, which is a super good sack outlet, but it's so expensive that I didn't buy one yet, and I'm in Europe, so I only pay half your price. Probably don't buy it, but it can sacrifice a creature and then add 1 mana of any color, which would allow you to make infinite colored mana with your combo, so with the Treacherous Pit Dweller. And this would in turn allow you to sacrifice Tegrid and use her backside to win. Because if you have infinite black mana, you can just untap Tegrid's Lantern as often as you want, and then use the tap effect to make your opponents sacrifice all their non-land permanents and then lose 3 life as often as you want. You can do this in a less effective version with Ashnod's Altar. In this case, you can only do it as much as you have black mana. This one would be strong and would allow you to have another win con, but probably do not do this because, as I said, first of all, Phyrexian Altar is really, really strong. and maybe even too strong for most play groups if it's utilized correctly. Now, next up we have Pox. Each player loses 1/3 of their life, chooses and discards 1/3 of his hand, then sacrifices 1/3 of the creatures and 1/3 of the lands. So I'm not really sure about this one. For it to be effective, you would need to have 3 creatures on the board. So basically, you would need to play 2 creatures, then play your commander, and then play Pox, because you want your commander to be alive when the player sacrifices the lands, so that you sacrifice your lands and your opponent sacrifice their lands, and then you get all the lands back. So again, as this is $10, probably hold off on buying this one until you find out whether or not you regularly have 3 creatures on board or not. Because for less than 3 creatures, you would need to sacrifice your commander, and you don't want to sacrifice your commander to Pox.
Okay.
Now, next up, we have Reanimate, which is quite cheap. This surprised me. So it seems to... it had a reprint in Jumpstart. Okay, that explains a lot. And it's also not that much more expensive in America than in Europe. It's, I think the first card had cost the same. Basically, Reanimate is a sorcery for 1 black mana. You can put a creature card from your graveyard back onto the battlefield. So it's another cheap reanimation effect in case your commander got removed. If you find your commander removed a lot, I would probably add Reanimate to your deck.
Okay.
And last but not least, we have Smokestack. You said you already had a look at this card. So just to explain the card in detail and why it's great for you. Basically, you play it at 4 mana, so you play it the turn before your commander drops. So ideally, you would do something like turn 1, jerk off, turn 2, play a mana rock, turn 3, play Smokestack, turn 4, play your commander. Now, there's one thing that is important. Smokestack has 2 different triggers, and you can put these triggers on the stack in any way that you want. So usually what you would do is first you put the Zeus counter trigger on the stack, and then you would put the sacrifice trigger on the stack. So on your 5th turn, basically when you want to play your commander, you sacrifice a permanent for each Zeus counter triggers first. At this point at the game, this Smokestack does not have any Zeus counters on it. So you don't need to sacrifice anything on your 5th turn. And then you put a Zeus counter on it, so every player after you will have to sacrifice a permanent each turn, and then you can just add more and more and more Zeus counters until you hopefully have them sacrificing lands and you get their lands.
Okay.
So the very important thing is that you do, basically your opponents always need to sacrifice 1 more permanent than you do, because you can put the Zeus counter on it after you sacrificed, and it does not hinder you in turn 5.
Okay. Okay.
So that's a big misconception about Smokestack, because usually people think, I have to sacrifice something and then I'm at a disadvantage when they remove it, but you don't actually need to sacrifice something. And if it eats the removal, then they have less removal for your Tegrid. So as I said, this would be the changes that I'd make. As I said, for now, if you don't want to add a expensive land, simply add a swamp, and then what? Sorry again.
No, I said okay.
Okay. If you want it just cheap, simply add everything in cheap, and this will allow you to have sack outlets and play reasonably well. If you look to upgrade your deck, as I said, the first things would be at whatever. If you find yourself running out of steam, or as dust if you find yourself wanting to have more board wipes and more explosive spells that end the game. Grave Pact, if you just find that the effect of Dictate of Erebos is really, really strong and you want more of that effect.
Okay.
Living Dead, again, for more board wipes. Memory Jar, only if you really like the deck, and probably don't go for Memory Jar. Reanimate, if you find your commanders getting removed a lot. Smokestack, because it's cool. And everyone will hate you for it. And that's basically the things that I would go first for with upgrading the deck.
Okay.
Do you have any questions for the deck?
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I did have one question, actually. Because since there's a lot more of like a sack kind of theme going on with this, would a card like Bitter Blossom work really well as giving like something to sack a lot of?
Yes, it would work well. The issue here is that, first of all, Bitter Blossom is quite expensive. So I think Bitter Blossom. And also you don't really need it. While it would work well, the crux here is whenever you sacrifice something, you also want your opponents to sacrifice something. Basically, you have a few sack outlets, but you will use them mostly to protect your commander or to achieve their effects with the creatures that you already played for their effects. Okay. And basically, once you have your engine running, you won't need that many creatures to sack, because your commander will provide you with creatures from your opponents that you killed.
Okay.
So basically, your opponent's creatures are your 1/1 fairies that you want to sacrifice.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Do you have any other questions?
I mean, no, that was really well explained. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Sure. So I will just post this to you, I guess.
Okay.
And if you don't have any further questions, then we are done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Seriously, that was really helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope the deck works. I think I've only played one mono black deck so far, that was Shirei. I don't know if you know the guy, nope. Shirei. This one. So basically, if a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you get it back at the end of the turn. This works every turn, so basically you play a lot of 1 power or 0 power creatures and a lot of sack outlets, and then you put them onto the battlefield, you sack them each turn, and your opponents are in misery.
Oh.
But yeah. Yeah, and as I said, the reason why I put this more to a sacrifice theme is because you will need to have... you cannot prevent your opponent from playing anything. And this is why you will need to have stuff on the board and also ways to get rid of their stuff. And as I said, this card would most likely fizzle late game. Because late game, if you play this card, like, your opponents won't have any cards in hand. Okay. Alright, if you don't have any more questions, we are done.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye. Okay, so this was the stream, and with that, I'm also gone for now, and maybe I'll stream later. Bye.